This is the second in a series of conversations about John Woolman. I don't remember when we had the first one, but it's, I guess, available. The video is available through the website. This discussion is, at least provisionally, titled Woolman's Holistic Worldview. I wanted to start us off by saying that there are two senses in which I've come to understand Woolman's worldview. One is the spiritual, rational reinforcement, the way he wove the rational and the spiritual together in his writings and over the time of his life and the way he lived his life. The second sense is in relation to his worldly concerns. I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and then I'd like to engage in sort of a participatory exercise, if you will. One of the things that I've noticed in reading and studying Woolman is that there's a chain of causality that he recognized that doesn't necessarily come out in at least in much detail as frequently in other early Quaker writings, at least the ones that I've read. Example from this book called The Wisdom of John Woolman, and it was put together by Reginald Reynolds. It's basically a thicker, less counterpart to the Rex Ambler book of quotes from George Fox. These are quotes from various writings of Woolman, and this one is from a journal entry in 1764. And Reynolds titles this entry, Pride and Vanity, Causes of Strife. Doth pride lead to vanity? Doth vanity form imaginary wants? Do these wants prompt men to exert their power in requiring that of others, which themselves would rather be excused from, or the same required of them? Do those proceedings beget hard thoughts? Do hard thoughts, when ripe, become malice? Does malice, when ripe, become revengeful, and the end inflict terrible pains on their fellow creatures and spread desolations in the world? Doth mankind, walking in uprightness, delight in each other's happiness? And do these creatures, capable of this attainment by giving way to an evil spirit, employ their will and strength to afflict and destroy one another? And as with anything that I read from or any documents that I share, if anybody's interested in those, just let me know and I'll be glad to provide copies. So you can kind of see this sequence of starting with a certain behavior and then moving from that behavior to another that was caused or somehow prompted by the first behavior, and so on until you get to the point where it's in the worldly concerns beyond individuals. The end point of all this ends up being war. So another example in terms of the worldly concerns of Woolman, and I'll share a document here, it relates to silver vessels. Let's see. Let's see how I do this. It says share screen, Carrie. And then it just gives a number of options in terms of who can share.
No, let's see. When you click the little green button, well, I don't know what kind of device you have. There's one that says share screen.
I got it.
And then you should have a selection of the windows on your desktop, if you have a desktop. I don't know how it works on other things. Is this going to be something with sound?
No.
Okay.
No. John Woolman was not available to record the sound for this. So no, it's let me pull it up in there.
Well,
I don't want to speak with you. Do you like that better?
yeah, unfortunately, what you've shared here,
Yes,
what
I'm
what
just
you
pulling
need
up
to
the
do, okay,
document.
that's
There we go. Okay, this is the document.
it's not visible.
It's not.
Yeah, I think what you need to do is leave that document up there. What kind of a device are you using?
I'm using a laptop.
Okay. There should be a little tab that says View Options, I think. No, that's on mine. What you want to do is unshare in the sharing for now.
All right.
Okay, then start again. Click on Share Screen.
Yeah.
And then you should have a selection of different windows, one of which should be your document. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah.
There you go.
You're showing.
Okay, yes.
Super. Harry, I don't know what I'd do without you
You're
in
welcome.
many respects, but in this day, technology. So, taking Woolman's concern about silver vessels, using silver vessels, which he considered a luxury, um, he was concerned because, as a luxury, this represented people's living beyond their means. And obviously, that ties into our testimony of simplicity. But that in turn is based on greed, which leads to oppression and then the resentment of the oppression and ultimately war. If you look below silver vessels, the practical considerations and concerns he had that were all linked to silver vessels were one, the transatlantic trade. Silver vessels to him were representative of the problems that transatlantic trade created. And it just so happens that off to the side of transatlantic trade is the whole issue area of slavery. And we could spend a whole forum talking about that, probably multiple fora. So it's noted there, but in the case of the silver vessels, the transatlantic trade gave rise to his concern about the lives of sailors. He took a voyage toward the end of his life going to England, where he ended up dying in Yorkshire. And the trip was in steerage because he refused to stay in the rooms that were occupied normally by passengers because he thought that the woodwork was too fancy and too representative of luxury and excess. So he stayed, for the most part, in steerage with the sailors. And he acquired an understanding of the lives of sailors and the connection between those lives and the transatlantic trade and ultimately silver vessels. He also was concerned about the live birds that were transported in steerage in cages so that sailors would have something to eat. And he saw these birds suffering in their cages from the conditions and from not having been out and in grazing in farm yards and so forth. So he specifically talks about not only the sailors, but these live birds in his journal account of the voyage. Then from the sailors and the birds, silver vessels caused him to be concerned about the miners and the conditions under which they worked in order to generate the silver ore, which in turn was turned into silver vessels. He actually had a dream about miners, I believe it was miners, certainly it was workers, where the workers gained a resentment of their oppressors because, in their view, aside from the way they were being treated, their oppressors claimed to be Christians. And if their oppressors were Christians, that must mean that Christ was a bad person. So they blasphemed Christ. And obviously, the miners' conditions combined with the notion that this would bring people into a condition where they were not open to the Spirit. In fact, they rebelled against the Spirit, going back up to the silver vessels, made silver vessels really noxious. And so much so that when he was traveling in the United States and he stopped with friends for the night and they offered him drink in silver cups, he was very thirsty from his travel, but he declined because he didn't feel like he could drink from those vessels and still be true to his beliefs. And ultimately, because they were friends, they acknowledged it rather than being insulted and brought out something other than silver from which he could drink water. So the silver vessels provide a good example of this process of thinking about the practical aspects and the way these practical aspects and concerns assault our spiritual beliefs, his spiritual beliefs. So I wanted to, at this point, talk about the spiritual rational reinforcement that I mentioned at first, that all of his concerns were grounded in the spiritual, and acting on those concerns was one way of encouraging others to do so, and in the process coming back to a strengthening of the spiritual life. So I think a lot of people often juxtapose spirit and reason. And of course, it depends on how you understand the term reason. It was understood differently in his time than we understand it now. But we tend to think that they're in conflict with each other, when in Woolman's case, he clearly used reason to understand these various connections, but that was in service to his spirituality rather than at odds with it. So at this point, I thought it would be useful to sort of go through the process that I outlined with silver vessels with another concern, something that the group would like to kind of process in this way. Any of the concerns that we talked about in the first forum in relation to Woolman be fine, or any other concerns that are generally the kinds of things that we get involved with on the worldly side of things. Anybody have a suggestion or a preference, or is there something that everybody would like to go through in this way? Anybody?
Plastic.
I'm sorry?
Plastic.
Plastic. Wow, that's a good one. Of course, there's lots about care for the creation, all elements of the creation in Woolman, and this is a great example, and it's interesting to think about what he would have thought about plastic. Probably wouldn't have liked plastic cups any more than silver for different reasons. Okay, plastic. So what's our concern about plastic? Why does it concern us?
It's harming the environment, for one thing.
Okay. And how does that happen?
It's into the water.
It's into the water. What about the production of plastic?
It's a petroleum-based product, and it also has impact on personal interior.
Also has, I'm sorry?
Personal impact on our health.
Correct. And so it's a petroleum product, and what is used in converting the petroleum product to plastic?
A high level of energy.
High level of energy. I assume the process requires a fair amount of water. So we've got, see whether you want to think about it as concentric circles or this sort of flow in the diagram that I shared. I can get out of that now. it's the practical issue of plastics has a lot of facets to it. What about the people who are involved in the manufacture of plastics? What implications does that have for those folks?
It damages their health, and they are also contributing to the damage done to the environment. And then there are the people who live in the surrounding area around the plastic manufacturing facility. And then there's the Gulf of Mexico, where the liquid garbage from all this is going and damaging, to put it mildly, the wildlife that fishermen and shrimpers base their livelihood on, and that we all enjoy eating, or some of us do.
When you mentioned the, now I forgot, the people who are involved in manufacturing and the harm to their health, what about their livelihoods? What about the economics of their making a living? Perhaps more so in other countries, in third world countries who are making plastics, but perhaps in our country as well. What are their work conditions like? How much money do they make? Are they being paid a living wage? And even if they are, how does that compare to what the executive in the plastics company makes, or the shareholders? So even talking about the individual involved in making plastics, these ripples keep going out further and further. What else about plastics?
Well,
Sorry.
go ahead.
It encourages
Yes.
a kind of throwaway. We can just make another one, kind of, instead of conserving and using what we have over and over again.
The disposable community. I remember immediately when you say that, Melissa, it brings to mind when I lived in Germany as a teenager, one of the words that really struck me, because the ecology movement was, as with many things in Europe, was a few years ahead of the one in the United States. And Germans are famous for making words, pulling a bunch of stuff together and making a longer word out of a series of ideas. And the German word is Wegwerf Gesellschaft, which literally is the throwaway society. And that's basically, plastics are basically part of that. So then we're back to right use of resources, whether it's plastics or I need the latest sneakers because I'm a big fan of some basketball player. I'm a teenager now speaking, and I really want those latest shoes. Well, are your other shoes worn out? No, I just want them because everybody else wants them. And where are they made? Well, they're made over here somewhere in some foreign country, but why should I care? Because those people are basically subsisting so that you can have your sneakers, and the sneaker company can charge you several $100s for them. So this then gets to, and I don't want to stop the conversation about plastics. Anybody else want to say something about plastics? Did we leave any plastics on the moon? I don't know.
Well, I want to
Go
say
ahead,
that
Joanna.
I recently learned that along with our shipping plastics over to other countries to get rid of our garbage, they don't have any place to put them. And so a man who was giving the report on the radio said that he had seen them burning the plastics with no, you know, like raking more plastic onto a pile and burning it. And all this toxic smoke was going up and they didn't have any protection.
That reminds me of a piece that recently aired on PBS about veterans making claims for lung problems and cancers that they claim had something to do with their serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there are these burn pits. All plastic and other stuff are burned, and the smoke in the video was amazing. It was completely black cloud of smoke coming up in the burn pits, and yet the VA was saying, "Well, we'll prove it."
And that
How
was
you got this condition.
that was taking place in Vietnam War too, and the folks who managed the burn pits had similar outcomes.
Yeah.
So we haven't learned much.
Remember what I wanted to go back to. Somebody was talking about where these manufacturing facilities tend to be located and how it affects the population. Well, they probably tend to be located, and a number of other parts of the industry that contribute to plastics and that generate a lot of foul stuff are probably located to some extent, if not to a large extent, near communities of color, because that's what we do. We put the nasty stuff somewhere where, not my backyard, put it over here. So there's that aspect of racial justice that manufacture of plastics creates. Any other plastics implications?
This is Paul. It is possible to make biodegradable plastics out of plant material now. And you can even go into, say, a place like Wheatsville, and some of their dishes are made out of potato starch. And hemp can also be used to manufacture biodegradable plastic. So that's something.
That's an alternative that would be consistent with our testimonies. So from there, I kind of want to turn to this spiritual rational relationship, or relationship between spiritual and reason, and talk a little bit about how we talk about this to other friends, to people beyond our community. And we can talk about it in terms of our testimonies. We can talk about it in terms of what we've done here. You know, this is what's happening, this is why it's bad. But we can also kind of back up a couple of centuries and ask ourselves, how do we talk about this in terms of the spiritual underpinnings of our testimonies? And is there a way to do that that will be received by the people we're talking to? Anybody want to respond to that? Do we need to do that, or is it okay just to join the rest of the folks in the argument and or the conversation and speak in terms of our testimonies themselves?
I just want to put in something here. The recognition that we use plastic for some things that it's possible it wouldn't be possible to use, like medical stuff. And I just have to put that in kind of as a devil's advocate point of view. I know how much easier it was for my grandchildren, for my children to raise my grandchildren, because plastic also. The heaviness of things when, carriages and all kinds of things were very difficult, even in 1975 when I had a child. So I'm just raising that, that the practical end of things, and I don't think it has any better justification for it, but it comes to my mind, and so I have to bring it up. I mean, in some ways, for poorer people, it's a way to make things that is not as expensive. So we have to look at that. I mean, wood is really expensive. There's all kinds of reasons for not using some things.
Sure. And there are fewer and fewer people who know how to work wood to put it into the products that we need. So the question of whether it would be effective and with what folks with whom we're talking to speak in terms of the spiritual origins of our testimonies and not just in the language of the testimonies themselves. Are Quakers open to that kind of conversation, or have we moved on and thinking and talking in terms of the testimonies themselves? Is that enough? Is that all we're comfortable with? Are we even comfortable talking about the spiritual underpinnings, the scriptural underpinnings, if you're a believer in scripture? Is that something we're comfortable doing, and who would be receptive to that message?
Well, for me, one of the things is that I do take the spiritual underpinnings seriously when I realize that plastic allows us to save the lives of people. And so that's a balance. You know, I don't know whether silver did that or not, but certainly it does allow us to save the lives of people, children and adults. So that comes into my spiritual consideration.
But I just wanted to respond for a minute to what Liz said, and I'm not picking on you, Liz, by any means, but in that example, understanding the spiritual underpinnings, if you were talking to somebody else in the religious society of friends or somebody outside our community, would you talk in terms of the injunction to do unto others? Or is that going to turn people off?
What came to mind for me is the right use of materials or the right use of the environment, because clearly everything we use has negative and positive impacts, and it's a question of, to the degree and purpose, it seems like to me, where plastics could be used to save lives, internally, externally, that seems like a wise use. The extent to which plastics are put to use, however, and the promotion of them and just the straight convenience and profit motive for them, that's another issue entirely. So I don't think it's just about plastics. I think it's about purpose, use, and motivation.
Well, another scriptural context, and these are all contexts that I think if we looked in the Quran or the text of any other faith tradition, we probably find parallels for a lot of these. But in terms of our sacred text, if you will, or the sacred text that stands behind the origination of Friends, another way to talk about it would be in terms of those parts of the Bible that speak to responsibility for all of creation, and whether, again, going to that kind of spiritual language, whether that would be a non-starter for a lot of folks. And the reason I'm asking this question is because I wonder whether, because so many of these ways of speaking about concerns of ours are so common among the various faith traditions, whether people wouldn't find that we were really getting to a root of these issues to which they could relate in their own tradition, and might be compelling in a way that a discussion based on the testimonies and these kinds of reasoned and rational arguments, perhaps some people just becomes stuff that flies by them because they're so used to hearing it, and they're so used to believing, well, this is the way it always was, as opposed to trying to find a new way to think about these issues and perhaps motivate ourselves to, because they're embedded in our faith traditions, to become more engaged with that kind of foundation in mind. That's kind of a question in terms of viewing the process of engaging people with these issues. And my sense is that day to day, a lot of us have gotten away from that. And I don't know, that's the case with people in other faith traditions. I suspect with a lot of people it has. And there no doubt are Quakers whose reason for being Quakers is more explicitly founded in Scripture, who might talk about these issues at that level. And if I went to a yearly meeting and so forth, or some of the other national and international gatherings, I probably would encounter some people who do, and maybe there are people in program meetings who are more likely to look at these issues from that perspective. I don't know, but it's still there's still a question in my mind as to whether that offers a path to a conversation that is more universal and speaks to people on a more basic level, core level. Anybody have a reaction to that? Thoughts about it? Has wondered the same thing and hasn't come up with an answer, as I haven't. Is that a weird question? A little off the beaten path? Called weird before. I said I've been called weird before in that context. So I won't take it personally.
Well, I find that the principle that you're promoting and presenting is one that is useful in a wide variety of conversations across a gap, across a divide, and that is, instead of is to listen, understand, and then move down beyond positions to interests, and from interests to values. And if you can find the common value point, then those connection is easier, the conversation is more seen as more rewarding for both sides and so forth. So I think the idea of going beneath just the basic positions and facts is essential when you're talking across a divide.
Other thoughts? Anybody in the meeting house? The physical meeting house? We're in the virtual meeting house, I guess. There's an interesting book that I came across in the process of thinking about Woolman. In fact, there are a lot of books that I've come across that are just fascinating that aren't directly related to Woolman. This one is called The Prophetic Imagination. It's by I think he's a theologian by the name of Walter Brueggemann. And his position in the book is that it takes a prophet to use language and in such a way that makes clear that there are other realities that are possible. And he uses the example of Solomon and the fact that until people got the idea that something better was possible, they were all going through every day, like a lot of us, I'm sure do, basically accepting the fact that this is the way things are. And, you know, we don't have any choice but to put up with all the things that are oppressive in daily life. But then along comes somebody who speaks a language, speaks in metaphor in such a way that people go, I guess something else is possible. And that makes, you know, room for radical transformation. And so all this relates to, in my mind, the fundamental question behind plastics or any concern that we have that's grounded in the status quo. What's the language that we can use that gives people hope in a sense that, yeah, we could be living a different world. And so if we believe that, then we find ways to go out and make that happen. And I don't know whether it's scripture. I don't know whether it's you know, taken from other texts or other faith traditions. But clearly from the case that Brueggemann was talking about, the language that became scripture was what convinced people that something else, something better was possible. So that's one of the reasons I'm talking and thinking about language in this context and asking these kinds of questions.
It's interesting that you're talking about language. When I think about Woolman, I think about deed. I think about how he lived his life and the ministry that he did. And I'm not clear that, I'm sure his language was gentle and kind of, he had a sense of humor too, obviously, because he could give, you know, he could give the, he could pay for the slave service to the master, and, you know, tell the master that he had to give the money to the slave. And I think he had some very special ways of listening, probably, as well as, but it was in his actions, I think, that he was most powerful. The fact that he had given up slaves, being part of the slave situation, and he, in every sort of way that he could. And that's what I find hard in my own life, is that actual giving up of plastic, you know. I mean, it's one of the things that I struggle with every day as I, you know, open a new plastic bag. Right. Anyway.
And yet, Liz, we know about Woolman only through language and his writing, and that's what has persisted and provided that vision. His impact would have been a tiny pebble in a great sea otherwise.
Maybe that's why I attempt to be a writer.
I think I agree with you, Liz, that the deeds are what, you know, when we think about Woolman and read about Woolman, the deeds are really inspiring in the way he lived his life. And it's hard to imagine being able to do that today. And that's the other thing. There are just so many, transatlantic trade was for him an issue. For us, it's you know, the global trade picture. And everything that we own probably has some element of poorly paid labor behind it. So, you know, what are the alternatives? In a lot of cases, there aren't any. But
the only alternative for us would be to go off in a secluded community and weave our own clothes and our own bread and all of that sort of thing, which I'm not recommending to anybody, because I don't think it helps the world, just to separate. But it is interesting. I'm sure that people in Woolman's day said, "Oh, I could never do what he did. You know, I could never do what he did." And so I won't deny that it seems harder today, but it was pretty hard then too. And there were the negative parts of his life that
Yeah.
didn't go so well. So,
It was, and it was in part his example, but it was also in part the way he talked about the example and the concern, and not only the manner, the gentle manner that you mentioned, Liz, but the actual language that he chose to use in speaking about the concern of other people in the society, particularly slaveholders. When he was making sure that they understood that holding slaves was contrary to God's injunctions and to Christianity in general. And his example, of course, was powerful, but he was speaking to people to whom that issue, that question of consistency with Scripture and so forth was important. And they got that. That was something that they could wrap their minds around in a way that living without slaves was, practically difficult. And what will I leave for my children, and so on and so forth. But when he spoke from that kind of with that kind of spiritual language and from those spiritual sources, he was speaking their language because they had that language in common. Today, as I said, does it work? I don't know. Even in our society, there are times when we're such a big tent. I don't want to use Republican terminology, but we're such a big tent that I can imagine it doesn't work with some Quakers. No.
It brought to mind the way in which Martin Luther King Jr. transformed the Christian message to make it one that could motivate people to a new vision of reality and relationship. And I think that's the point about the transforming language has to come from a place that people can identify with, which he did masterfully.
but the other thing is that for Woolman, it came from deep searching inside and deeply in his spirit. Those words didn't come from, weren't things that he was writing down, as a journal in the sense that we journal, some of us. He was waiting to hear the message from God, and he often tested that message people around him. So yeah, it's an interesting thought to think that we might be able to use the Bible, the biblical language with some Quakers who we don't necessarily see as being as proactive on issues as we are. I think we discovered as we went out that particularly around some of the issues of environment, a lot of them are just as concerned and active as we are. So, but it doesn't seem like, it seems like in this country, the rather than people mattering, it's property that matters. And that's something I think that, if you go back to the start of our that's been an argument since the start of our nation, and constant argument. I think if Quakers had been more in the forefront than other Protestants when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, it might have been different in the Constitution.
Well, another challenge, it seems to me, in using either scriptural language or faith text-based language, thing now about other faith traditions, is that in the case of Christianity, the language of the Bible has been co-opted by the fundamentalist Christian community in a way that a lot of other Christians of various denominations find it difficult to relate to the language because, if I start speaking in those terms, then I sound like so and so, who I think is crazy or whatever. So maybe the answer is not using biblical language per se, but finding a way to take biblical language and paraphrase in a way that gets to the root of the language, gets to the true meaning of the language without, sorry, that's me, warning me it's 10 minutes, without turning people off who make that association. I don't know. A lot of this is just kind of coming to mind as we talk, which is great for me because I get to write them down in my notebook. Unless somebody has something else that they want to say, that's 10 minutes for having a little silence and then centering before worship. Does anybody want the last word?
I'd like to say one thing I think is interesting. We have kind of the opposite problem that Woolman had. Woolman's concern was how luxury stuff was hurting us and hurting other people. But today, it's the really big problem is stuff that's so inexpensive that plastic being an example, that we tend to think of it as being disposable. And so we have both those problems now.
Hey, friend, thank you very much. Barry?
Just to say, to me, the statement that's key to Woolman's attitude toward everything is, shall we try whether we find, this is a little paraphrase, can we try whether we find in these our possessions the seeds of war? And he would begin a process and reconcile within his own conscience whether he could participate in a certain practice. And if by his example he raised questions among his contemporaries, it came more from, when you start living that way, people may say, why is it that you don't use plastics, or you wear undyed garments? And from there can begin a dialogue. I think that we have to go a little further and say, does personal testimony, does personal witness go far enough in certain ways? And what are possessions? I'm trying whether there are the seeds of war in my use of social media. And I do not have many clear answers, but it is that kind of wrestling with angels that changes us. And that in itself is of some importance. And if we can bring people along in the same journey, then it's even better.
That's the last word. A little silence.